Hi, and welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show, the show for animal training and behaviour nerds, where I, Ryan Cartledge, interview the world's most proficient animal training and behaviour geeks. We're absolutely thrilled and grateful to have you here with us today. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on whatever you're listening to this on so that you don't miss a single episode. Each episode of this show is brought to you on behalf of the ATA membership. And if you like the conversations in this episode, then you're invited to continue them with like-minded behaviour nerds within the membership area, which you can find out more about at www.animaltrainingacademy.com. You'll get access to twice monthly live web classes, the back catalogue of previous web class replays, plus a huge library of videos and projects to help problem solve your training challenges. Plus, we're a sociable bunch with an exclusive private Facebook group and forum areas. It's like a Netflix social media platform for animal behaviour geeks. But we will commence today's episode where I'm looking forward to an insightful conversation with our wonderful guest, Dr. Nathaniel Hall. Dr. Hall is an associate professor of companion animal science at Texas Tech University and the director of the Canine Olfaction Research and Education Laboratory in the Department of Animal Science. He earned his PhD at the University of Florida, specializing in behavior analysis and canine olfaction. Following his doctoral studies, he continued as a postdoc at Arizona State University, investigating the optimization of training to enhance canines' detection of homemade explosives. At Texas Tech, his work continues to explore canine olfactory perception and how experience influences odor perception. His lab also investigates predictors and correlates of problem behavior, behavioral predictors of working aptitude, and the relationship between behavior and health using advanced statistical models. So without any further delay, it brings me immense pleasure to welcome Nathan to our show today, patiently standing by. Nathan, we really appreciate your time and are thrilled to have you join us at Animal Training Academy.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, let's dive right into our initial question today. For this one, Nathan, could you take the listeners back to the beginning, where you first discovered applied behavior analysis in animal training? We're keen to understand how you arrived at your current position.
So if we want to go all the way back, I started as an undergraduate where I was going to go to veterinary school at one day, as many sort of animal-inclined people do, because if you are a young kid or a young person in any kind of career, you say, I want to work with animals, then the first thing everyone says is, oh, well, you're going to be a veterinarian then. And that's how you do it. So I was going to be a veterinarian. And actually, I was studying for an organic chemistry exam, which oddly enough, I did actually like organic chemistry. But I happened to pick up a journal article that was on the table when I was in the library. And it had a really interesting paper in it. It was in JAB, so the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior. And it was by Monique Udell. And it was about how behavior analysts should be looking more at dogs and dog behavior. And funny enough, she was at University of Florida, which is where I happened to be. So I reached out to the lab and was like, hey, this sounds really interesting. I knew nothing about behavior analysis at that point. I was a microbiology major. But I started getting involved in research. I thought it was pretty cool. And how I got involved in the animal research is actually serendipitously that I happen to have a rabies vaccine because they wanted to do this project with bats. And to work with the bats, you had to be rabies vaccinated. And I don't know where it is where you guys are. You probably don't even need rabies vaccines, but it's really expensive. It's over $1,000 to get it done. And because I was going to be a vet, I was already rabies vaccinated. So I coincidentally got a shoe-in doing that. So I did a study with bats, which was a lot of fun. And they found a cheat in the system or a game, and it was using their sense of smell. And that was really fascinating to me. And as I started working in research and behavior in general, I really found that I like trying to figure out the why of questions, not necessarily trying to fix things. So that sort of moves me away from medicine and really interested in research and trying to understand the fundamentals, the why questions of why does this work? Why does this happen? Kinds of answers. So I continued working in that lab. I ended up going to graduate school at University of Florida in a behavior analysis department. So they didn't really have an animal program per se, other than the dog program that I was in. But it was a experimental analysis of behavior program. Did a lot of work, or did a lot of studying and applied behavior analysis. So Dr. Brian Iwata, Tim Vollmer, Mark Branch on the experimental side, Jesse Dallery, Clive Wynn. And that was my graduate school training. And so that's where I sort of got my behavior analysis foundation. And ever since the bats found a cheat using their sense of smell, I've kind of really been interested in it. And obviously I was working with dogs, and I was like, oh, well, dogs would be a great subject. We use them for detection work all across the world for so many different things, so many different tasks. There must be a bunch of research on that topic so that we know everything about it. And I couldn't find anything. In fact, there's very, very little research in that area. And at first I thought, well, maybe it's all secret, but the more that I sort of dove into it, it was really this kind of amazing thing that we all use, or we look at the dog's nose, but we actually have very little understanding of what the perceptual experience is, what are sensitivity limits for different odors, and how it compares to other animals. And for the most part, most of the things that you know about your dog's nose was probably just made up by somebody at some point, and we just keep perpetuating it. So you probably have, heard 100 times over, everyone likes to use the dog sense of smell is 100,000 times better than humans, or 10,000 times better, or whatever number you happen to use. But to be honest, I cannot figure out anything where that's related in terms of actual numbers, except for one particular chemical, and that chemical smells like bananas. But outside of that chemical, there's a wide variety of chemicals in which your own sense of smell is better than the dog's from the data perspective, and as well as where the dog sensitivity might only just be 10 times better, or 100 times better, or you're 10 times better. The data out there is extremely sparse, and it's actually very odor specific and odor dependent. Anyway, I could go on forever because it's so complicated. I just got so fascinated that, we use it every day for all of these different kinds of uses. It's an entire sport, and yet we actually know so little about it.
I love those serendipitous moments that change your life. The fact that this person
getting a rabies vaccine, yeah.
Oh, no, I'm talking about picking up the paper on the desk and having that actual individual within arm's reach in terms of they were there at the organization. I've had those moments, and they're pretty unlikely, potentially, but life-changing. And their story of wanting to be a vet, I think we've heard that many times, but we've never heard anyone talk about rabies vaccinations and how that was a shoo-in. So when you say you found a cheat with the bats, using their smell, what does that mean? What does finding a cheat mean?
So in that task, what we were trying to do, or what we were looking at, is this will sound a little silly, but also complicated at the same time. Is at that time, this would have been around 2006, 2008, probably. There was a lot of debate going around about sort of following points. So hard to describe, but if you drop a piece of food, right, every dog owner knows that you can point to it and the dog will go to where you point. And one of the interesting things that sort of had come out in the late 90s, early 2000s was that in a lot of experiments with chimps and other kinds of primates, that's actually a very complicated thing, in that you could point to one of two cups in front of you, and the chimps wouldn't spontaneously just pick the cup that you pointed to in at least some of those initial experiments. But then your dogs would, and that was actually quite a trivial task for most of your dogs to do that. And as a part of that came out what was sort of called the domestication hypothesis, or still is the domestication hypothesis, that domestication had this sort of fundamental changing of dogs' sort of potential comprehension of human behaviors, that through this long period of evolutionary history, for working with and trying to understand humans, that dogs had evolved this kind of capability. So we were, Dr. Udell now, or before she was previously doctor when I was working with her, and Clive, who had been doing a bunch of different studies, was trying to highlight, maybe this is a learned behavior through traditional kinds of mechanisms, that maybe what domestication does is it improves the potential for the dogs to be interacting with humans to begin with, but then other processes that we know of, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, end up, making these very simple tasks, right? You have a point where there happens to be a piece of food there. There's some type of local enhancement, some salient stimulus there. The dogs pick it up so quickly that it seems like it was almost natural to the dog or evolved. So one of the questions was, if this is a readily learned behavior through different kinds of experiences, that non-domesticated species should be able to do it as well. And we happen to have a population of bats near us. If you know of the Luby Bat Conservancy in Gainesville, it was actually funded by Mr. Bacardi. If you know Bacardi, the rum, there's a bat symbol on it. It turns out they're a big lover of bats. So there was a large bat conservancy that was near where we were at, and they happened to have some bats that were hand-reared for a variety of different reasons. And, it's Florida, so people have different animals just because, and they happen to have hand-raised them, these exotic bat species. But anyway, long story short, they had some animals that were hand-reared, had been around, others that were not hand-raised. And the question could this non-domesticated species be able to solve this very simple question? I put up 2 cups in a reverse hanging order. So we had to kind of invert the entire process, point to one of them, and then would the bat spontaneously walk and go check behind the cup that was pointed towards? So I had to point upwards instead of downwards, and things were suspended. And we found out that the answer was yes. But along the way, during some initial control trials, what we found is that where the bats would go, we would put nectar behind the one that you pointed to when we had sort of this control nectar sample, and the one that we didn't point to, is that after they went to the target one, they would rub up on the actual jar itself. And that jar, because it sort of had the nectar, we would refill it. It would sort of move along with where the ones you happen to be pointing to, is that they could actually follow their own scent mark of where they happen to have gone previously, and where there was the baited container previously. So we had to sort of institute this kind of wiping procedure of cleaning the different glassware between. Otherwise, they could recognize, or presumably through some type of olfactory sense, where the correct target was based off of where they had previously rubbed up against the jar. And in that purpose, or for that experiment, it was more of a nuisance or an annoyance than anything else that we were able to solve and continue with the study. But it was one of those things that kind of lingered with me and stuck with me. It's like, that's really interesting. That's something that I never would have thought of, that only if we did these control tests would we have found to begin with. But it was something that I was interested in exploring more. And because I was then in a dog lab, I was like, let's do it with dogs. It should be easy, right? Famous last words. And then I've spent pretty much the last 12, 13 years working with dogs and olfaction.
And you mentioned you're the kind of person who wants to figure out why. Has that been a strength of yours throughout your life? I know I was speaking to someone recently and they said it was a strength and a weakness because they can become obsessed with figuring things out.
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely be an annoyance to the people around you. Many times it's like, it doesn't matter. It just works. Okay. I don't need to, you don't need to know why it works or why that happened. It happened. I think in some respects it is a strength because it makes you question bigger picture and understand, because if you have a full understanding of what's going on, then you are better able to predict and address problems as they come across. So if you understand why this is happening, then if a problem comes up, you know exactly how to address it. But sometimes it does, get you stuck in a situation where you really just don't have enough to know why. And sometimes you kind of have to just move on because it's working. And it's really hard to move on. I'm getting better with learning that some things, the why will have to come later or will be an entire career's worth kind of search. But I think that sometimes it's a strength, sometimes it's an annoyance, and then sometimes it can hold you back when maybe the why is not actually what's most important at a certain point.
Interesting. Well, thanks for sharing about that. I find that really interesting. It's a different way of thinking than myself. But both yourself and the other person I'm thinking of are highly successful in their fields, likely influenced by the way you think and your desire to understand why. And it, I assume, facilitates critical thinking. You mentioned earlier that some of the things that we take for granted and say about dogs' senses have probably been made up. And as you were saying that, I realized, I say some of those things. And we've just done a whole month on critical thinking at Animal Training Academy in our membership. And so it's a reminder to apply that type of thinking to all of the areas of our lives. Would you say so? It's a reminder to have a critical thinking mindset.
Yeah. I think critical and skeptical thinking is important. And in fact, I think, I can't remember what exactly the example was the other day, but there was something where someone said something and I immediately just accepted it because it sort of just went along with my beliefs. And then I thought, wait, how in the world would they know that? How in the world would they have that information? What would be the evidence that would have possibly have come from that? There's just no way that there's a study that actually looks at that, or that there's we say things all the time, especially when it comes to dogs and olfaction, because we just are very readily to believe, anything you hear about it, because that's one thing that we don't have a personal experience with, If we talk about breeds, people will, criticize you left and right because it's that's not what my dog does, or something like that. But when you talk about olfaction, it just seems we're very readily to believe it because it just seems to go along with some kinds of things. But then it's well, how do you know that? How do dogs have 100,000 times better sense of smell? How do you know that? Is that for all chemicals? Is it for all different kinds of odors? Is that universal? Why 100,000 times and not 99,000 times? It seems oddly, general. How can you know that for odor discrimination? How does that apply to different kinds of tests? And then you start breaking it down and realizing, oh, that was probably just made up, wasn't it? But there's a lot of different, even when we talk about the number of functional olfactory receptors, right? We'll say, the dogs have, depending on exactly which numbers you're looking of, recently around 600 different types to 900 functional olfactory receptors. And us, meager humans have 300 to 600. And so that means that the dog has such a great, a much better sense of smell. Then you might ask, well, why? What functional, consequence does that produce? Yes, it's bigger numbers, but what does that actually mean? And when you start sort of digging that apart, the answer is actually, we don't know. We don't really know what that functionally means. And in fact, there are some theories out there that suggest it may not mean as much as we think it does. We then compare it to the elephant, who has 2,000 functional olfactory receptors. What does that mean? Then we compare it to birds that typically only have 100 or so functional olfactory receptors. And they also, we'll say birds don't even have a sense of smell, but we know that that's not true. And in fact, some birds actually have quite a fantastic sense of smell. So I even forget where I started off on this point, but I think critical thinking is important, and trying to understand how you know something, and why something works it makes you more prepared to ask the questions that gets you a better understanding of what do you really know and what you don't know.
Yeah, I'm really glad we had this conversation. It's something that I've been learning a lot about this year and trying to develop my skill set in, and we've been talking about a lot at ATA. So thanks for sharing all of that. And I'm just happy that I have got your passion talking. My goal is to get you to say things like I forgot what we started off on with this conversation. So can you share with us, because I'm interested to learn more about your research, and we're going to talk about that and its practicality to us as practitioners who might work with our learners and utilizing their sense of smell. But what does a typical day look like for you now? And also, where can people go online to see your research and get in touch if they wanted to get in touch?
Yeah. So a typical day, I don't think I have a typical day, to be honest. I'd say a lot of days I'm unfortunately a paper pusher. I have students, I manage students and the team. So I do a lot of management, but a typical day in our lab really just kind of depends on what projects we have going. And we're also just, I don't know, the reason why I love research is that you just don't know what you're doing when you wake up every day, because you just end up going in different directions. So like, for example, our postdoc just yesterday planted a vineyard of 100 different grapevines. Why are we doing that? Well, we've been working on some project on detection of an invasive species, which is a spotted lanternfly, but then also powdery mildew, which is a type of fungus that grows on grape crops. And we've been doing this project, and it's like, we need to get more access to the actual samples to have more control leaves versus infected leaves. So we're growing our own vineyard now. Yesterday, yes, I was potting, vineyard plants and learning how to make the correct ratios for the soil. Seems to be kind of off for dogs. But anyway, so I don't know what a typical day is, but I say a typical day for our lab is depending on what projects we have. We'll have dogs sort of running through detection training. So we've set up pretty much an automated detection training program. So we use olfactometers, which are basically computer-controlled ways to deliver odors to the dogs. And we kind of just reverse the concept of a Skinner box. So instead of putting the animal inside of the box and all of your equipment outside of the box in the laboratory, we put all of our equipment inside of the box, and then the animal is outside of the box. So the animal is out and free running, so the dog is out doing things, but we have these little boxes, which are odor stimulus delivery devices that also we train the dogs to hold their nose in them for a certain period of time that the computer picks up with IR beams. And then it can register an alert response, which is a 4-second consecutive hold. And then it makes a beep to indicate, just like a clicker, whether it's a correct response. And then we can have different settings on how we want to indicate if it's an incorrect response, et cetera. But that's kind of our bread and butter. And then we change out what samples we put in there to probe what's the detection limit, what's the lowest concentration you can go. Can you detect this versus some controls? Can you do a disease discrimination versus not? Can you generalize from this sample to another sample? So all kinds of crazy combinations that we come up with that, some days we're out collecting water samples to look for these little microscopic villagers of invasive zebra mussels. Other days we're planting vineyards. Other days we're doing detection of explosives. So it's quite variable on what an average day is. And then you had like 3 parts to the question. What were the other parts?
Where can people go online to find the research that you've done and get in touch with you? So that was the 2 parts.
Yes. So Google Scholar, if you Google Scholar Nathaniel.J.Hall, you'll get to my research. But also if you just Google Nathaniel J. Hall, Texas Tech University, dog, something like that, you'll get to my webpage. If you go to the publications link, I am not always great, but I've gotten better on making sure that I have free PDFs of all of our studies. So if it's a study that I've published, we have a free version of that for you. So we try to publish open access when we can, but it actually costs researchers a lot of money to publish open access. So when we don't, I do make the copies available online for you guys, and they're available on that publication link, and you can just download all of our papers. And you can email me, nathaniel.j.hall, Hall, at ttu.edu.
Awesome. Thank you for all that. And I believe you're also sort of a sought-after speaker. You're collaborating with one of our recent podcast guests, Nicole Felisadowski. Do you want to tell us
Yes.
about that? Because that's coming up, her event, isn't it?
Yes, so she's got an event coming up the weekend of June 25th. There will be hosting a hybrid event that will be in person, but I will be speaking remotely, as well as Dr. Erica Fierbacher. Information for that event can be at happy-fellow, FELLOW.AT. If you go to that website, you can find the link to their seminars, and that seminar will be on there.
Awesome. And we will link to that on the ATA website as well. Hey, thanks so much for sharing everything so far, Nathan. We love hearing about people's behavioural odysseys. So we're grateful to you for sharing. Nathan, our listeners are constantly striving to enhance their knowledge, skills, and confidence to better meet their animals' needs. And given the range of challenges that come up for trainer, it's clear that a wide array of knowledge and experience is needed, which is where you come in. Also, when we consider needs, it's important to remember, as we've been talking about, that many animals, especially dogs, or maybe not, you tell me, heavily rely on their sense of smell. This area of animal care can seem daunting as there's so much to learn. It's, as you mentioned, hard to understand what it's actually like to perceive the world from that vantage point. And it can become a bit overwhelming, especially if you're just getting started. But you being an expert in this field, you've done, as we've talked about some impressive research, and I'm thrilled to dive into this topic more with you today. Your findings can have, I believe, profound practical implications for animal trainers, and our listeners are eager to hear about it. From your research, Nathan, what would you say are 5 key insights that those practicing in the field of scent work can apply practically in their work? Can you get us started with insight number 1?
So I think insight number 1 kind of goes back to what we were talking about previously. Is I'd say most of the things that you think you know, just throw it away and start again from scratch. So a lot of the things that we come into knowing, or prior information, a lot of times is not actually based on data. So unless there's actual data to support what it is that you are thinking, then I would consider taking it as tentative and not fact until you have facts for that. I think there's a lot of things that are super strongly held opinions. And when you say, okay, can you show me the data that supports, your very strong opinion? And the answer is there isn't any. So an example I like to use of that is, or we actually did a study starting on that, where breed differences, right? If you Google different dogs' capabilities to detect different things, or breed differences in olfaction in dogs, you'll immediately pop up 30 or 40 different websites that will tell you the best breeds for doing different kinds of scent work or detection work. And it will give you, breed number 1 is this one, breed number 2 is that one. And we couldn't really find any papers on the topic. There's really just a handful, literally about 3 papers on the topic. And we're like, all right, well, let's do some foundational work in this area. And we were like, all right, let's pick, a dog that shows up on the top 10 list on pretty much every list you find on the internet. And it was the German Shepherd. And then we picked a sight hound as a comparison, so greyhounds. And we thought, well, let's pick a dog that never shows up on the top 10. We happen to have a good number around, and it's probably the worst dog you could think of for olfactory work. And that was the pug. So we found 10 German Shepherds, 10 pugs, 10 greyhounds, and we all tested them on a standard detection test where they had to learn to detect a specific target odor. And we got the data, and essentially all we were just trying to do is just prove what everyone already knows, right? Or I hate to use the word proof, and you should never do that in a scientific perspective, but just demonstrate what everyone already knows, is that the German Shepherd is the ideal dog for this kind of stuff. So we get the data, plot out the graphs, and we're like, we made a mistake. We somehow labeled all of the German Shepherds as pugs. So we went back, went through the data, and I was like, oh wait, we didn't make a mistake. This is actually the case. the pugs blew the German Shepherds out of the water. The pugs were absolutely fantastic. 9 out of 10 pugs were at 100% detection performance, whereas the German Shepherds were averaging in the 80s. So then we're like, all right, well, maybe this was just because they learned it a little bit faster and they did better there. What if we dilute the odor? Then the sensitivity limits would show some differences. And then again, the pugs blew the German Shepherds out of the water. They outperformed them on even the lowest concentrations that we tested the dogs on. So then we thought, well, maybe the pugs were just like more motivated, for food motivators, and that there was some difference that was just based off of motivation rather than olfactory capabilities. So we did a visual discrimination comparison. And in that case, the German Shepherds and the pugs performed identically. So it wasn't some general motivational differences. We tried to match the visual and the olfactory task. The effort that they had to engage in was exactly the same. The amount of walking they had to do, the task was still the same. It was still a 2-choice task. And in that performance, it was absolutely identical. The only difference came up is when we gave them an olfactory task. So then it immediately brings up a variety of different questions. And, the take-home point is not necessarily that we all need to switch to pugs, because there's a variety of reasons why in an operational working environment you don't want a pug. That's not really the take-home. The take-home is that a lot of our assumptions that we come into the game are not probably data-based. And a lot of our opinions are probably not data or evidence-based. And we have to question which of them are and which of them aren't. This isn't to say that everything you do has to be backed up by evidence, because you'd be way too restricted in that, because the science can't keep up with the amount of things that need to be done as practitioners or trainers. But what it means is that you have to know which of those are your opinion and which of those are data-based. And if they're data-based, then you don't really have a lot of wiggle room in having an opinion against the data, right? But if they're opinion-based, then you do have a lot of wiggle room until the data comes to that. But I think it's really important to challenge what those beliefs are that you have and recognize which ones are actually truly coming from direct evidence of that and which ones are not. That was long-winded. Sorry about that.
No, it was a great example, though. And I think there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who are feeling uncomfortable because now they're having to add new thoughts into their day, into their life, into their work. Do you teach to your students intentionally critical thinking?
Like my undergraduate students and other students, do I teach it intentionally? I don't know how to teach it. There are ways that we can talk about how to teach it, but I find it very challenging to, say, okay, today we're teaching critical thinking. But the way that I try to do it in the classroom and with my students is through, not combative, but a very challenging way. So whenever we have some type of situation and an assumption comes up, I just simply ask, "Oh, how do you know that? How do you know that, or what evidence do you have for that?" And try and pull out and make them, try to get back to where, why do they have that specific belief? Do you know that, or do you think that, or do you believe that? And trying to separate those three out. So one of the things in the classroom is that I actually have the students go through and develop their own research project as a class. And at first, it all seems simple, easy, super simple, very easy. They'll come up with a simple question like, one thing that came out like a couple of years ago is there was a newspaper article about, whether dogs like to be hugged or not. Should you hug your dog? Should you not hug your dog? Dogs don't like to be hugged, kind of thing. And, so it was in the popular press, and I asked the students, does your dog like it when you hug them? Hug them? And all the students are like, yes, my dog loves it when I hug them. Then I show them this, article, and it's like, oh, well, this article says that your dogs don't like it. How do you figure out how to do that? Or how do you figure out if that's true or not, or whether a dog specifically likes it? So in reality, you can set up a simple reinforcer kind of test and see different kinds of petting mechanisms. How does your dog actually want to be petted? Have you ever asked your dog, if you give them a choice between different ways, will they show a preference between one or the other? Or is there a reinforcer effectiveness difference between one type of petting versus another? But as you start to unfold a lot of the details, it quickly becomes very complicated, that things that initially sound simple are very difficult. Do you have two people doing it? Are there two options available simultaneously? How do you make sure that it's the right person? How do you make sure the dog isn't just going to the right versus the left? How do you, reverse reverse the people, reverse the contingencies? How many times do you test? All these kinds of questions come out. And I think that's actually a really good exercise in starting to understand the actual process of research, because I think a lot of us, even when it comes to actual research, right, is that, we'll take the newspaper headline of the research that comes out, or the last line of an abstract of what the research says when it comes out. But there's a lot of nitty-gritty details that go into that makes it very, very specific to very specific situations that those results hold. And there's actually even more complicated things about science, about replication and how often does replication have, and what is a p-value, and what is, sort of statistical repeatability, versus what a p-value actual means. So there's a whole bunch of more complicated science questions, but there's even simpler questions of how was this test actually done, and how do you set that up? And I think when you have to think through a lot of those practicalities and trying to make that translation of, idea to practice to a result to a conclusion, that is really helpful in developing that critical thinking, because you realize that something that seems like a simple statement that you make actually has a lot of complicated questions that come along to be able to make that one simple statement. I'm sure that doesn't resolve any feelings of anxiety or uncomfort, but
yeah, but that feeling of anxiety and uncomfortableness is an area of growth, and one that I, as the host of this podcast, would like to incorporate into what we offer in this show. And I guess if it's going to make you so uncomfortable, you might not listen to our show anymore. But hopefully, it cues an opportunity for growth and learning. But I guess it can be challenging to come across as non-combative when you're just saying, but how do you know? But how do you know? Some individuals might find that aversive. All right, looking at the time, let's move on to number 2. Thank you for sharing number 1. Most of the things that you think throw them away and start from scratch. Number 2.
I lost my train of thought now after I've spent so much time on 1. So now I have to come up with a good number 2. Number 2, I would say, now that you've sort of thrown away all that you think you know, I'd actually like to add in a little bit of caveat, is that your olfactory experience, asterisk, to some degree, is probably not terribly off from what your dog's perception is. And so bear with me, for a couple of minutes as I explain this. And there's going to be a variety of different kinds of things between what is liked versus not liked. But generally speaking, we'll like to portray that the dog's olfactory world is so far outside of our realm of olfactory experience that it's like echolocation versus regular hearing. And for the most part, the evidence doesn't hold up to that. And in fact, there's a pretty interesting paper, if you want to play around and have some fun, that came out a few years back. And it's called Poor Human Olfaction is a 19th Century Myth. And essentially what that paper sort of pulls out is that for a long time, we have grossly discounted our own sense of smell. And part of it is because perhaps we're not always consciously aware of the impact of odors on ourselves. But whenever we test it, we actually are quite odor responsive beings to a wide variety of things. And when you actually test humans, we're actually pretty good at it. So, everyone probably knows about how dogs can, there was a paper that, came out recently that highlights that dogs can, smell fear or smell whether someone was afraid or not. And humans can do that too. And actually, there was an interesting paper. We all know about how dogs can detect disease or COVID-19 infected people. And there was actually a paper that came out is that if you have humans sniff T-shirts of people who recently had a respiratory cold versus people who didn't have a respiratory cold, humans could actually differentiate that as well, so that you could smell the T-shirts and determine whether someone was sick or not. So our sense of smell is not the same. And I don't want to say that they are the same and that there's no perceptual difference, because that would be ignoring a wide variety of body that shows that. But I do think that in a lot of practical senses, that I don't think you have to throw away your sense of smell as something that could at least be a marker of your dog's perceptual world. And why I say that is when we're doing different kinds of tests, we smell everything. I have smelled everything we've ever given to a dog. And I do it personally. And it's amazing what different kinds of things that you can pick up that you would not have thought of. Like if you can, maybe my container is not as clean as I thought it was. You can pick that up most of the time. Maybe the odor that I'm now giving my dog because I changed brand smells different. You can pick that up most of the time. That if you're doing a lot of training things, smell everything before you give it to a dog. There's nothing that we give to a dog that we don't smell previously. And I think also a lot of times, particularly in a lot of sport worlds, right, is that you'll take these essential oils that can be very, very strong. If you don't smell it yourself beforehand and think, wow, that blows my head off, it's going to do the same for the dog. And it might explain some different kinds of responses you might get the first time the dog comes across the odor. So in a lot of these situations, with the exception if you're doing some things that you shouldn't be smelling, like cocaine or something like that, or fentanyl, right? Don't take it too seriously. But in most cases, smell it yourself and don't completely discount your perceptual world.
Very interesting. In the interest of time, number 3.
Have fun. When you're working with the dogs, and this one, I'm going to go off of the sciencey basis, but if you're not having fun, it just seems to really impact the dogs, and it just impacts a variety of different things. I mean, I think having fun is actually, it's hard to quantify and hard to say it. But I mean, if you've been training in different situations and high stress environments or fun environments, there just seems to be a difference in responsiveness and it's very hard to quantify, but in my experience, it's important that you're having fun when doing it.
Is that what you know? Is that what you think, or is that your belief?
I would say belief. I would say I have not quantified it in any particular way. I would definitely say it is not what I know. And it's probably somewhere between I believe and I think, because I have some like anecdotal feelings, but I'd say it's probably more of a belief rather than a I think nor or a I know. It's 100% not an I know. But yeah, great question. I like it.
I was channeling my inner Dr. Hall there.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
From your research, Nathan, what would you say is the 4th key insight that you'd like to share with those practicing in the field of scent work that they can practically apply in their work?
So I think number 4 is going to get more practical to your actual scent work and operational detection dog handlers. And that is wherever is going to be your operational or test environment or work, your training has to match it. And your training has to match as close as possible to it. And I'm not just saying of like location or environment, but a wide variety of things. So one thing that happens, and what a lot of our research has recently shown, is that when we are training for scent work, we tend to put out lots of different target odors or lots of different or a high frequency of target odors for our dogs. And the reason is because we want to train our dogs to odor. So we have to have lots of odor, and we want to reward the dogs as frequently, reinforce that as much as possible. But then when you get to an actual challenge or an operational environment, if you're doing explosives detection work, the probability of you finding something is hopefully 0 or as close to 0 as possible, right? It's really, really low. In fact, dogs are highly sensitive to these changes between a training context and an operational context, and it produces very different performance levels. And in fact, we can set up just simply the two nearly identical rooms and just change the frequency at which a target odor appears, where one room target odor appears almost every search, and another room target odor appears almost 1 out of 10 searches. We'll have completely different search behavior in that. And the way that we got sort of the biggest boost of performance is making sure that our training environment was more closely matched to the operational environment in things like frequency of target odors. And by doing that, it's basically building kind of extinction resistance to the situation where you have very infrequent target odors to find.
So in the case of explosives, that would mean starting at frequent odors where there's an odor present in every search and slowly fading it out. So in every second search, every third search.
Exactly. So we did a progressive lowering of the frequency of target odors. And when we did that, we were able to get a really big boost in performance in that low frequency environment. At some point, obviously, you're going to get extinction, right? If you have a search dog who's searching forever and never finds anything, you will get extinction of that. And there have been several papers on that topic. But what you need to do is get the dog in some type of intermittent target odor frequency. So basically, if you think of it as a two-part behavioral chain where the dog searches, comes across a target odor, that's the conditioned reinforcer for search behavior. And then the dog makes an alert response, which is then reinforced with the terminal reinforcer, Kong, toy, food, whatever that happens to be. You can think of that first chain being search that's reinforced by appearance of the target odor. And what you need to do is build some type of schedule of search to coming across the target odor that will meet what your operational needs will be. And if your operational needs are so target poor that you can't maintain that, then you have to use something else like some type of training aid that is safe that you can put in your operational environment, or something else that your training and your operational context can match. Otherwise, the dogs can essentially use the reinforcement schedule of target odors appearing, or the frequency at which target odors appear, as a cue to whether they're in a training context or an operational context that's under extinction. And that itself can indicate, I'm under extinction, I'm not going to find anything today, so I'm just going to go do something else. Or this is a training day, I'm going to find a bunch of things, performance is sky high. And the real risk is that every day in training where you're doing your testing and recording, you can be like, wow, my dog's performance is fantastic. And then you go out on this search for 2 hours and not find anything. But in reality, your dog's performance was substantially worse than what you expected from training, because your dog has discriminated the frequency of target odors in the two contexts, and search behavior has extinguished in your operational context.
Can you think of an example, a human example that people could relate to, where the environmental cues cue different behavior? However, ideally we want, maybe for ourselves or our boss or our managers want performance. Does that question make sense?
Yes. I have to think of it as in terms of a two-part chain. I think the simplest one, is, I like to use this, the simple reinforcement schedule of comparison of, operation of a Coke machine versus a slot machine, and the situations in which, you have two different contexts, right? If you put your money into a Coke machine, which is step one, push a button, and nothing comes out, right? What happens? Most people typically will not put in another thing. You have complete extinction after one response that's not reinforced. Some people end up with the Coke machine on top of them because they have an emotionally induced extinction response. Or maybe they start pushing other buttons as extinction-induced response variability. But if you put your money into a slot machine, push the button, and no money comes out, what do? Is it broken? How do you walk away from the slot machine? Is typically no, you put more money in, and that's because essentially it's the partial reinforcement extinction effect schedule is essentially what it is. But you have experience that in one context, that a non-rewarded response doesn't mean that extinction is truly in effect, right? A slot machine, if you get a non-rewarded response, you have experience in that, mostly through verbal, unless you play a lot, that extinction is not necessarily in effect, meaning that you don't expect that the machine is broken if you don't get paid out every time. Whereas with a Coke machine in a different context, you have lots of experience that there's a one-to-one relationship or a continuous schedule of reinforcement, and that you don't have experience with these sort of non-rewarded situations where you push the button and nothing comes out. It's not quite the same as detection because there's a search behavior, but it underlies a similar sort of partial reinforcement extinction effect. If that makes sense.
So is what we want to do with dogs who move from the training context with a high level of stimuli and sense for them to target on, or whatever their indication behavior is. We want to teach a partial reinforcement extinction effect.
Basically, yeah. So if the operational environment, and this depends, right? Because if you're working in a sport context where you're going to have 5 targets in your search environment, you're going to have 3 targets in your search environment, and you're not going to have to do, long durations of nothing there, then this is a little less applicable. But if that is going to be a challenge for you, because for the most part, one difference between sport and operational is that most operational dog jobs is clearing things, saying nothing is here, rather than finding something. But in that context, what you need is you need to prevent extinction of search behavior, because if nothing's going to be there, and it's the same type of, what we call like a vigilance task with humans, is that you have to maintain attention with infrequent targets that are coming. And how do you necessarily do that? And in this case, what you want is to make sure that you have some type of experience, or that the dog has been trained to a schedule of target odor appearance that is something that you would be able to maintain in an operational environment.
I have more questions, but we have no time. So let's move on to number 5. We've done 4 out of your 5. What's the last one, Nathan?
All right. So we talked about, you have to recap for me. Sorry, real quick. Lost my
Number 1 was most of the things you think throw them away and start again from scratch. Number 3 was your olfactory experience. Star to some degree. It's probably not terribly off. Number 3 was have fun. Number 4 was your training environment has to match your operational environment.
Yes. So number 5, thank you, is that your odor needs to match your operational odor. So a lot of times, things that we don't think about as being different, and odors are very complicated. Odors themselves. So, I've spent most of this time talking about dogs, but we spend actually a lot of time talking about odors themselves, because the way that olfaction works is just not fun. It's very complicated. And, things that we think should smell the same perceptually a lot of times don't. So a good example of this is carvone. So carvone is a chemical. If we want to go all the way back to the beginning of today's and talk about organic chemistry. So carvone comes in essentially 2 different forms. Stereoisomers, there is a carbon atom, and there is a slight difference in the rotation of that carbon atom. So carvone has 2 different forms, or stereoisomers. It has the exact same chemical formula. So, and if you're just talking about chemical formula, they are identical. But there's just a slight geometric change in one of the carbon atoms of that molecule. And that is enough such that if you smell one of those molecules, you will smell something like caraway seeds. Some people describe it as like shoe leather. And if you smell the other version of that, it will smell like mint. You would never confuse these 2 together. And in fact, you wouldn't even say they smell similar. And in fact, you wouldn't even probably say that they are the exact same molecule with the exact same chemical formula. Well, not the exact same molecule, but exact same chemical formula. They're just stereoisomers of each other. So it makes it very difficult to take the chemistry or the chemical component and translate that to perception. So a lot of times, and there's definitely a lot of value to understanding the chemistry of things, but a lot of times, we end up thinking that there's a single molecule that explains dog behavior, or that if we just understood the molecules of this, we would then understand the perception. There's a big, complicated chain of events that go on that goes from chemical to perception that actually makes that really, really challenging. And so the best thing that we can do, as a practitioner, if you're trying to make sure that your dog is going to respond to what they need operationally as a chemical mixture, is that you need to make sure that your training chemicals actually match that, and match that as well as possible, or that your dog has training on variations of that particular target that would cover this, the stimulus continuum or the stimulus class of what is necessary for responding to what your target happens to be. So if you're in the sports, what that means is that you might want to train on different lot numbers of your chemical or of your odor. You might want to train on different brands of your odor, or at least make sure that you have trained on the specific lot and specific brand that you're going to be testing on, because there are very subtle differences that can have really important perceptual differences, and generalization from one odor to another may not occur spontaneously. And in fact, tends to be a challenge with a lot of different detection tasks, is getting the appropriate generalization from one to the other. Because a lot of times you can have overtraining to one very specific example of a target, or one specific brand of a specific lot number, that you actually get failure to other brands or other lot numbers of the same type of oil mixture or whatever your target happens to be. So thinking about, so going back to, point 4 is making sure that your environmental conditions are similar between training and operational. You want your odor to be a similar matching between your operational and training environments, or at least prepare in training for varieties that might occur operational, because generalization is very hard to predict. Olfaction and translating chemistry to perception is incredibly difficult. And in fact, there are supercomputers working on it, and they're almost getting a good job at it. But it's very hard. If you just give me a chemical formula and ask me, what will that smell like? We can't do that.
Because you can know what the chemicals are, but there might be a variation of that chemical in terms of the components are the same, but how the molecules are behaving in that chemical.
So it goes down to the specific chemical and the olfactory receptor interaction. And that is a highly physical and complicated at a molecular level process that we don't quite understand yet. And there are actually different theories about how that entire process happens that is still controversial and debatable. So because of that lack of understanding, we actually cannot just necessarily predict how novel chemicals will be perceived without testing it. So if you say that, I use this mixture and I added this chemical to it, what impact will that have for the dogs? I have no way of predicting that unless I test it behaviorally.
Awesome. I had no idea about any of that. So, Nathan, your insights and anecdotes have indeed lived up to our high expectations. Unfortunately, though, this does bring us to our concluding question for this episode. Nathan, I'm curious if you could offer us a glimpse into the future you maybe did there with supercomputers, and share your vision for the next 5 to 10 years in the realm of scent work and research. What do you want to see happen? What do you think is going to happen?
So, going back to points 1 and 2, what I'd really like, for the field is to really get back to what do we actually know from a data perspective? So what do we know? and almost sort of building that as our baseline, and then sort of establishing what those building blocks are. And then we can essentially establish a science off of those building blocks. Because right now it's even hard to know what we don't actually know, because we take so many things for granted, if you will, that it's actually hard to know what is that baseline level of fundamental knowledge that we have, and taking that and establishing that for the future. And then secondly is really in the field, incorporating that perceptual questions or that psychology component from the dog perspective, I think is going to be really important. So as I said, there's a lot of value to understanding the chemistry of the odors that we're using, but that's only one piece of a very big puzzle. And because the chemistry, don't tell my analytical chemistry friends of this, is, they have an instrument or a machine that they can put things into. There's still a lot of complicated things that actually make their job very difficult. But, there's a machine that can tell you those kinds of different things. But it's not easy to understand what does this smell like from the dog's perspective. So I think putting a little bit more investment and time in trying to understand the dog's perceptual world will pay off dividends over the next 5-10 years.
Well, I think that's something our listeners of the show are super interested in. Again, a huge thank you, Nathan, for all the insightful information you've shared today. Before we wrap up, could you let our listeners know, again, where they can learn more about you, your research, and how they might reach out to you? And 5 days, maybe 6 days after this podcast is released, the conference you're going to be involved in, if they want to hear more about your research specifically that way, and how they can attend that virtually from anywhere in the world.
Yes. So reach out to me. My email is nathaniel.j.hall@ttu.edu. If you want to see what we're up to at the lab, I run the Canine Olfaction Lab. So Facebook/Canine Olfaction Lab, Instagram @Canine Olfaction Lab, or good old fashioned Google Nathaniel J. Hall, dogs, Texas Tech will bring you to my webpage with the publications. And then, of course, the seminar that I will be speaking at with a variety of other much more famous and cooler speakers than me. You can find the information there at happy-fellow.at.
Splendid. Well, we'll make sure to include those links in the show notes for easy access. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here, Nathan. On behalf of myself and all of our listeners, we sincerely appreciate your time and your willingness to join us on the show today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
We do, of course, really appreciate all of you tuning in today as well. And if you have enjoyed this episode and you were interested in carrying on the conversation about working with our animals in the most positive, funnest, choice-rich ways, then as mentioned at the start of this episode, the Animal Training Academy community is waiting for you. Head on over to www.animaltrainingacademy.com and click on the membership button in the main menu to learn more about what members are describing as the Netflix social media platform for behaviour geeks. That's it for this episode though. We're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again so much everyone for listening. You'll hear from us again soon.